Going through fertility treatments brings up all sorts of medical questions, but it also brings up some really personal ones. Today, we're diving into one of the most common concerns out there. Can something as simple and natural as sex actually interfere with the very medication that's supposed to help you get pregnant? Well, science has a pretty reassuring answer, so let's get right into it.
So this is the big question, right? If you're using a vaginal medication as part of your treatment, probably the last thing you want to be worrying about is whether being intimate with your partner could somehow be messing it all up. It's a totally understandable fear, but thankfully, it's one we can finally address with some solid data.
Okay, so to really get to the bottom of this, we've got to introduce the main character in our story today, a super important hormone called progesterone. It's basically a cornerstone of many fertility treatments, and it's also the very reason this whole question about intimacy even comes up. Just think of progesterone as the ultimate nesting hormone. I mean, its whole job is to get the uterus ready and welcoming for an embryo to implant, and then to help keep that pregnancy going strong. So in treatments, like say a frozen embryo transfer, doctors will often prescribe extra progesterone just to make sure the environment is absolutely perfect.
And this, right here, is where the rubber meets the road. A really common way to take this extra hormone is with vaginal suppositories. So it's only natural for couples to start wondering, hey, if we have sex, could that mess with the medication? Could it dislodge it or change how my body absorbs it? It's a very practical question.
And this wasn't just a worry that patients had, it was a legitimate scientific question. There was a real puzzle here that researchers realized needed a clear, definitive answer. So let's take a look at why there was so much uncertainty in the first place.
Okay, so here's the science behind the concern. We know that intercourse can temporarily change the vaginal environment. We're talking things like pH levels. And in theory, just in theory, those changes could affect how a drug gets absorbed. Now, this wasn't just a wild guess. There was an older, smaller pilot study that seemed to hint at a possible link. But, and this is a big but, it only looked at what happened after a single dose. That's not how the treatment actually works in the real world. So we really needed a better study.
So to finally solve this puzzle, a team of researchers over at the University of Montpellier in France came up with a really clever experiment. And honestly, the way they designed this thing is the key to understanding why the results are so trustworthy. Now, I know this might look a little complicated, but the idea is actually brilliant. It's what's called a crossover design. And here's the key. Every single woman in the study went through all three situations: a period of abstinence, having sex with a condom, and having sex without a condom. This is so powerful because it means scientists could compare each woman against herself, which gets rid of a ton of other variables. So here's a look at what a participant's week was like. They'd start with a baseline blood test after being abstinent. Then, later that day, they'd have intercourse one of the two ways, let's say without a condom, and come in for another blood test the next morning. Then, a few days later, they'd do it all again, but using the other method. This really careful sequence allowed for a perfect, direct comparison. And this flowchart just shows you how precise and careful they were. They started with this big pool of over 300 couples and slowly narrowed it down to the 30 who followed the protocol perfectly. See, it's not about getting the most people. It's about getting the most reliable, high-quality data you possibly can. All right, so after all that incredibly meticulous work, what did the blood tests actually say? Did intercourse make any difference at all? Let's decode the data. The results? Well, they were crystal clear. When you compared their levels to the baseline from abstinence, having unprotected sex led to this tiny, almost unmeasurable average drop in progesterone. We're talking negative 0.21 nanograms per milliliter. And with a condom, a very small average increase of 1.52. Honestly, these are just minuscule wiggles. And this bar chart just makes it even more obvious, doesn't it? You can see that little bar for unprotected intercourse is barely below the zero line, and the bar for intercourse with a condom is only a little bit above it. Visually, you can just tell that neither one caused some big dramatic shift in progesterone levels. And the statistics back this up completely. The study's p-value came out to 0.08. Now, you don't need to be a statistician. All you really need to know is that this number is above the cutoff that scientists use for something to be considered significant. So in plain English, it means the tiny little changes they saw were almost certainly just random biological noise, not a real effect caused by having sex. And here it is, the final conclusion, straight from the researchers themselves. The HRT cycle, by the way, just refers to the hormone replacement therapy cycle these patients were on. The finding is completely unambiguous. The science shows no significant effect, period. So, let's bring it all home. What does all of this actually mean for the people who are living this question day to day? What's the big takeaway from all this research?
You know, the single most important word here is reassurance. This study gives strong evidence that couples don't need to add another worry to their plate. Intimacy is not going to undermine their treatment. And that is a huge deal, because the journey through infertility is already so stressful. The last thing anyone needs is another restriction. It really looks like after a day or two on the medication, the body hits this steady state where progesterone levels are nice and stable and they're not easily knocked off course.
Now, of course, in science, it's always important to be precise. This was a pilot study, which means it's a great first step, and it looks specifically at micronized progesterone suppositories. So these findings might not apply to other ways of taking progesterone, like the gels, which have different properties. This study gives us a really important piece of the puzzle, but science, as always, is an ongoing process.
And that kind of brings us to a final thought. This whole scientific investigation didn't start in some high-tech lab with a crazy theory. It started with a real human question that couples were asking every day. It really makes you wonder, what other common, everyday worries in medicine could be answered and maybe even put to rest with a simple, clever study just like this one? Thanks for joining me for this explainer.